Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for that. We're so excited to have you here with us this afternoon to launch for sale South Africa's property laundromat. It's going to be a really intense discussion and very topical, and so I'm really excited to hand over to our panel in a moment. I just have a few housekeeping rules. The toilets are to your left on that side, and then there are also toilets at the back behind the registration table out through the glass doors. This event will be photographed. Mike is our photographer, as well as Jane at the back. So if you're not comfortable with your photograph being taken, please just raise your hand for a few moments so we know who not to capture. There is a row at the back. I know that's for no photograph specifically, but Mike, if you could just take note of the hands. If you could raise your hands again. Okay. Great. Okay, perfect. This is also just another announcement. No bigotry, no hatefulness or problematic commentary will be tolerated, especially during our Q&A session. So if that is the case, the microphone will be taken from you, and I hope that you understand this. And just a few comments from my side. My name is Luvano. I work with Open Secrets, and I was one of the drafters on this report, and I worked on the Equatorial Guinea section. And on my left here, we have Lester Kivett, who is our host, and we have Abby May, who is also one of the drafters from Open Secrets. We have Isaiah Mumbilo from the Congolese Civil Society of South Africa. We have Karen Hendricks from Reclaim the City, the Sissy Gool House Woodstock chapter. And finally, Raisa Patha, the lead author on the report. So we're really excited to get into this conversation, and we will have a Q&A session. So please, once you've had a look through the report, listen to what's happening today, bring it on, we're ready. So thank you very much. Oh, sorry, one final comment. Please don't walk in this front aisle because we are live streaming. So yeah, just a note of that. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's so nice to see so many friendly faces, and I'm sure after the next hour or so, I'll see people tomorrow, and I'll have more friendly faces that I've met this afternoon. Thank you so much for being here with us. My name is Lester Gibbet. I've been a journalist, living, working, born here in Cape Town. And I'm really, really fortunate to know good people, like the people at Open Secrets, like the civil society campaigners and activists who keep the city going, who are the real opposition when we talk to how we deliver, particularly to the most vulnerable in this city, in this country, this continent, and of course, around the world. My name is Lester Gibbet, as I said, and I'd like to start by saying that we should all be sensitive, we should all be aware that financial and fiscal malfeasance are not victimless crimes, that corruption and theft and fraud affects the most vulnerable and affects the poorest of this country, this continent, and of course the world, whether it be directly or indirectly. I don't think many of us know that the 246 million rand that was spent on Jacob Zuma's and Nkandla homestead, that money, some of that money came from projects that was meant to literally support homes that were built on sections of dolomite. And after years of mining on the East Rand, that ground underneath became unstable. And so instead, to prevent it from falling into sinkholes, they needed to do something. The money that went to build 246 million rand of Jacob Zuma's home was diverted from those projects, a direct impact on the most vulnerable. There's also, of course, the indirect impact, the consequences of years of capture, of theft, years of supporting, struggling, failing, and deliberately so SOEs, so that now today we live in a reality of austerity. Funny enough, our ministers, our president doesn't use the A word. They say cost-cutting measures. That's a direct consequence of bailing out SOEs where for years there have been wrongdoing. There's also indirectly the bad and deliberate bad decisions that affect the price of petrol, which then affect the price of food. It's affecting how much you pay for electricity when you have to insert your prepaid code into your meter. And there's, of course, also the access or the lack of access to affordable, decent housing opportunities in opportunities close to where people work. It's the laundry or the effect of this laundry process and how it affects the access to decent homes, quality homes, close to opportunities. And I think this is what this report shows. But there, of course, along with corruption, you have a corruptor and a corruptee. Someone who offers money, someone who takes money. But in the world of complex financial transactions, you need the private institutions, the professional institutions that help facilitate that. They're called the enablers. They're the organizations that are often held in high esteem. It's the law firms, it's the property companies, it's the consultancies that help facilitate this major national and international corruption. So there is no victimless crime, and that fraud and laundering affects the most vulnerable, the poorest of the poor, here in South Africa, on this African continent, and of course around the world. So it's my pleasure to talk to our panelists here today on what this report says and of course how it affects the most vulnerable. I'm going to start off with speaking to Raisa Barth, who's the project lead. Maybe if you can just sketch and tell us where we are at the moment, how we got here. Because a few years ago, South Africa was put on a grey list. This is a list by the Financial Action Task Force, which somewhat said and I'll have you explain what it means in depth, that South Africa, in terms of its policies, South Africa, in terms of what it allows and lets slide, is a rampant place for money laundering. And this then allows state actors, non-state actors to benefit from that. Lay the groundwork for us. Why does it mean, or what does it mean to be on a grey list?
Thank you, Lester, and thank you to everybody who's here. So yeah, I think this is an important question, right? Because we were grey-listed in 2023, and even though this is so important, it still feels like a lot of people don't know what it means to be on the grey list, and people don't know how it affects ordinary people like every one of us in this room. But essentially, there's a body called the Financial Action Task Force, and this task force sets the international standards to prevent and understand money laundering risks. It also deals with terrorism financing and proliferation financing, which is essentially the development and financing of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. Now, what particularly attracted the Financial Action Task Force to South Africa was essentially the state capture years, right? Because in the state capture years, there were rampant illicit money flows. I mean, some estimates say that there were 500 billion rand in illicit transactions that happened during the state capture years. And astonishingly, there has not been a single conviction in a major state capture case. So this caught the attention of the Financial Action Task Force, and they began to further monitor and intensely scrutinize South Africa. There are about almost 30 member states of this body, the Financial Action Task Force. There are also 200 countries that endorse the FATF standards, right, which are the international standards set for money laundering. And what the FATF found in South Africa was that we have laws to deal with money laundering, but they're not being implemented properly. We also don't understand terrorism financing risks in the country. And as a result of this, the Financial Action Task Force grey-listed South Africa, which was essentially a message to the world to say that South Africa is a high-risk country to invest in. So what does this mean? It means that when we have international transactions through banks or other institutions, there's a little red flag to say, when you bring money into South Africa, you're doing something dangerous. So what is the effect of this on people like us? Well, essentially it means that the currency, the rand, could weaken. And when the rand weakens, everything else becomes more expensive. There is also an influence here because we are perceived as dangerous territory to invest in. Institutions like the World Bank and other lenders might stop or refuse to lend us any more money. And when that happens, government debt increases. When government debt increases, there is less money to spend on public services. And when that happens, more people risk not having housing, not having adequate health services, and other important things that we need to have a good quality of life. South Africa has committed to getting off the grey list in June 2025. That was the date. Just last month, because we haven't done enough to strengthen ourselves for the international standards to exit the grey list, they've now pushed that back to October 2025. And this again still leaves us open to international scrutiny and then affecting our local economy and potentially deepening the cost of living crisis. So it has very real effects on people in the country. And this is why we thought it was so important to do this report, because we felt that the lawyers and their estate agencies and other private sector institutions weren't being closely scrutinized enough for their role in the grey listing and in supporting and enabling money laundering crimes. And so our work right now is to kind of put a focus on these institutions and to say that, hey, it's not just the state, we also need reforms in the private sector.
Yeah. But Abby, you've been one of the investigators on this report. South Africa has firm laws. In 2008, our banking sector was largely protected because at the time it was said South Africa's legislation, regulations were quite firm. We have legislation with regard to FICA, the Financial Intelligence Center Act. Surely South Africa's laws are robust enough to safeguard us from these actions?
You know, Lester, I think, sorry, I think that just to follow on what Raisa was saying now, our laws are robust, but it takes someone to enact those robustness. The, the idea that there hasn't been an actual prosecution from the state capture years that truly is, you know, one of the high level individuals that were involved in those cases and high level companies that were involved in those cases is incredibly astonishing. A lack of action from the likes of the National Prosecuting Authority is one of the many reasons why we remain on the gray list. But not only that, we're not the only Southern African country at the moment that's on the gray list, right? So Mozambique's on the gray list at the moment, Namibia's on the gray list at the moment. And so right now, our Southern African region is being highly monitored for these illicit financial transactions. But also, as Raisa was saying, when South Africa, for example, wants to get a loan like what we're trying to do with the Just Transition Energy Fund as well, right? The transaction costs that come with those loans are incredibly high simply because we are seen as high risk, right? And a consequence of that is that it just takes us far slower to transition, to a just transition energy landscape. And that's like a very tangible example of a consequence that comes out of us not being able to get off of this list, but then also, you know, our neighbors also struggling with similar issues of not being able to enact prosecutions, criminal investigations, and actually get the funds and proceeds that were stolen back through asset forfeiture.
Before I get to our in-depth analysis on the three countries that are focused in this report, Raisa, back to you. And what's the genesis of this particular report? Going through this report, there were some familiar names that if you've been reading news reports of lived in Cape Town or working in news, there are some names that come out, like the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea. He's now the vice president, Theodore Ngwenya. But why say we want to look into who's buying property in South Africa and where they're getting their money from?
Right. So I think, you know, when it comes to looking at how we compiled this report, it might sound a little bit odd to some people that we focused on these three African countries, right? Because we also know that there's a lot of foreign money from Europe, the US, and other countries that are also coming into South Africa to buy property. I mean, I think if any of us walk along Camps Bay or Clifton, we know that a lot of the property there is foreign owned, right? By people, particularly from the West. The reason that we chose these three countries is also because, you know, we want to show the harm that is being done to vulnerable communities by these private sector actors. If you look at Equatorial Guinea, over 70% of people in Equatorial Guinea live in poverty. Between 2004 and 2006, Theodore Obiang spent $42 million on luxury assets in the US and in South Africa. $42 million. That amount is 1/3 of the money that the Equatorial Guinean government spent on public services like public health, education, housing for the year of 2005. And he splashed that on luxury assets, and he was punished for it in the US. They found essentially, and I quote, that he looted his government to purchase those assets. In terms of Mozambique, there was a debt crisis, right, where the government took on secret loans to the tune of $2 billion. And as a result, assets worth 13 million rand. They bought 13 properties, and it was really Selemani, the adopted brother of Joseph Kabila, the former president of the DRC, who transacted, and he did it through shell companies, essentially pushing the money from the DRC through these hidden structures until he could purchase property in South Africa. So we contributed, our private sector institutions contributed to the harm of people there too. And that's what led us to do this report and focus on these countries, because this is where some of the most vulnerable people in the world are. And it goes to show the complicity of private institutions in that harm.
Maybe that's a nice segue to speak to Isaiah Mombelo, who is with the Congolese Civil Society of South Africa. Just detail the awareness, the political climate, but then also the opposition response to graft, corruption, politically connected people who are essentially benefiting off the most vulnerable. Maybe you can just sketch us the picture on how this would be received in the DRC.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate this privilege. And we're waiting for this privilege to happen in South Africa one day. And this is the time. And we thank you for being present here first. First of all, I wanted to tell you guys, Congo, it became like a financially colonized state in the system of Africa. And the African country claimed that Western looted Congo, but it is our time to loot also Congo. That is the full declaration of some of the African presidents, political people who are making sure this will happen. So regard this corruption which happened in Congo, it started a long time ago. We can start with the 1 century's matter which started happening. It became a culture of Congo. Like it's obvious, it's a country where we have a right to loot. That is the conception. And we need to change that conception as we're going to come out here. And the logic of the reality of corruption happened in Congo. I think when Laurent Desire Kabila was in power, I think you're standing for how can Congolese benefit the wealth of his country. It's been taken and it was being killed. And when Joseph Kabila took power, and he came to set a proper system where Congo should be looted properly without any hassle. So they're setting up a system where they're going to make sure looting can happen without any trace. So opposition trying to resist against this power, but it was so impossible because Congo is not like South Africa where the logic is you go and then you go to court and then you starting opening a case and then everything is being followed by court. Congo is a war zone. It's not a war zone in East, it's a war zone in the entire Congo. It means what? There is no war, but what happened in the war, it's happening in Congo everywhere. Meaning the killing, the easy way of killing masses, it's really something like it happened in the war zone. So whoever tried to raise their voice like opposition, what the government did, they started using the didn't give really support wanted for Congolese people to resist against the system of looting, where the power being there to make sure whoever tried, they'll kill him. So there's so many people being dead, and they silenced the opposition, and the opposition tried their best. I think some of them are not alive up to now. We have evidence of so many young people who are not alive, they're being killed and in front of people, and then no one can also say what. because the judiciary system of Congo is driven by the same government. Thank you.
Abby, maybe you can take us into some of the details in the figures. The term politically exposed persons. It sounds as if politics is an illness and you're exposed to it. My apologies to my politician friends who are here in the audience. But talk to us in some of the figures that you cover in the chapter on DRC. You focus, and there's a case study on Francis Selemani, who is the adopted brother of the former president Joseph Kabila. As Raisa said, 30 million rands worth of properties, 13 in fact, many of them already sold already. Give me a detail of who are some of the characters here, but then also, how does the laundry process work? Is it acquiring properties here to then further sell it for profit on the market, and then you walk away with it? Just first, some of the characters and how does this process work?
I'm going to answer your question backwards. I'll actually answer what money laundering is first. I speak for all the investigators involved in the team that even as we went through the evidence we found, speaking with experts, all of those things, we ourselves also genuinely struggled to kind of conceptualize and understand what does it mean to launder money, and then in turn, how to get accountability for that. So just give me a bit of time here to kind of explain it. On a basic premise, there's 3 stages to money laundering, right? The first is called placement, the second is called layering, and then the third is called integration. Money laundering is motivated by the fact that you want to clean money that you have stolen, corrupt funds, right? You want to make it legitimate. That is the purpose of all 3 of those stages. So, for example, in Mozambique, right, we have the hidden debt scandal. Basically, the Mozambique government at the time got illegal loans from Credit Suisse, which is a Swiss bank, and Russia's VTS, right, Raisa? And there was about roughly over 2 billion rands of $2 billion worth of loans that came from those 2 banks, and those loans were incredibly illegal. And the purpose of those loans was said to be that it was going to be used for public goods and services within Mozambique. And none of that happened. Those public funds were stolen, and in and of itself, the loans themselves were illegal. And so what happens? You need to make that money clean, right? We need to find a way to actually make it legitimate. And so what a lot of these PIPs, as we say, do, specifically in the report, is they create what we call shell companies, right? So, for example, in the DRC case study, Francis Selemani and his wife, Aneth, created a shell company not only in South Africa, but firstly in the DRC to assist them with cleaning the funds that they stole from, public funds that they stole from a bank called BGFI, which is headquartered in Gabon, but it's a very big bank that has a subsidiary in the DRC. And so they looted public funds from that bank because Francis Selemani at the time was the major executive on the board of BGFI DRC. And so what did they do? They create a shell company called Sud Oil within the DRC to kind of funnel the money so that they have a paper trail, a legitimate paper trail through banks, lawyers and things like that that are being reviewed that, hey, this money is being diverted there. For example, Francis Selemani at BGFI came up with a contract for Sud Oil and then diverted the funds in that way to Sud Oil in the DRC. Then what happens? They need to find a way to kind of layer that money and make it feel even more legitimate. And so they contract and create companies outside of where the money was stolen. For example, they come to South Africa, Francis Selemani and his wife created basically a shell company in South Africa as well called Gaveli. And they essentially contracted Gaveli to, Sud Oil contracted Gaveli to do work for them. There was no work being done. There was nothing happening, right? This was just to kind of have a paper trail for them to be able to say that, hey, these funds are legitimate. And so the money comes to South Africa, the stolen money, right? Then they have a problem. How they're going to can say that South Africa, you can come here, buy property. If you have the money, it will speak. If you don't, you will not get the property. And so through the assistance of estate agents and lawyers in South Africa, the Selemanis were able to purchase literally 13 South African properties. In one day, I think that Selemani, correct me if I'm wrong, Raisa, but in the report we state that they literally bought 11 properties in one day. And that's just kind of astonishing, right? Not only that, many of the lawyers who were involved in that transaction basically facilitated that, right? How is it possible that this one couple, who are said to be public officials who are they're not earning 30 million every year, right? Are able to kind of purchase these things. And so that's kind of the process that we're talking about here. And I mean, the South African Financial Intelligence Center throughout this year, right, trying to fight, trying to kind of get us off the gray list, has been begging, estate agents and lawyers to actually start practicing what's required of them. Like if they see anything suspicious, then they need to report that. Mm-hmm. I mean, the FIC has literally done media reports calling them delinquents at this point. It's getting that bad. And, at the end of the day, who suffers, right? As Isaiah was saying, that money was meant for the people of the Congo. Those individuals who are being killed, who are being slaughtered within the DRC, that money was meant for them. And then not only that, the money laundering and the lack of prosecutions that's happening within South Africa then places ordinary South Africans who are waiting for their homes to be built, right? Many of us in this room can speak to that, right? Another consequence of this is that they don't get to actually have the time and attention that's needed from the South African government to actually build those homes. And it's just incredibly terrible. But I hope that answers your question. That
answers my question. Dre, so I think that we should also stop describing state capture as just some form of grand corruption, just stealing. State capture was an anti-constitutional project in that weakening systems and institutions so that eventually you can get away with it. But also what I read through this particular report, whether it be the DRC, whether it be Mozambique, or whether it be Equatorial Guinea, is politically connected people in the form of dynasties, political dynasties, and how that isn't democratic. And let's focus quickly on Equatorial Guinea. I don't want to go below the belt, but Equatorial Guinea has been in the news lately because of a government leader who's supposed to focus on corruption. In fact, that's what's been happening in the bedroom. I won't go into detail, but it's quite ironic that issues of corruption capture in Equatorial Guinea involves this particular person, but also it involves the son of the president of Equatorial Guinea, who is also the vice president, Teodorin Ngwenya. Just talk to me about how constitutionalism has been affected in South Africa, but also through dynasties. the democratic process has also been hampered.
So Equatorial Guinea is an interesting story. And I don't know if everybody here has really read about Equatorial Guinea, but inside Open Secrets, we refer to the Obiang story as really a Game of Thrones story. And it starts with Francisco Macias Nguema, who became the first president of Equatorial Guinea after independence from Spanish colonial rule. And when he became president, he really entrenched corruption. There was obviously the project of empire and colonialism in itself is a corrupt project. It is a project that involves dispossession, stealth of land, of home, of resources, of everything from the people that belong to that land, and then removing it to these elites who come in and just take, right? And when the Obiangs came in power after Equatorial Guinea reached independence, Macias, he actually left the capital. Some people describe him as having gone through a state of madness, and he was paying himself $10 million a year. And his nephew, Teodoro, sent a delegation to kind of talk to him and reason with him, and his reaction was to massacre the entire delegation. And so then Teodoro became increasingly concerned, and he eventually overthrew his uncle. He threw him in detention, and Macias was executed. Teodoro has been in power for more than 40 years. It is one of the longest running dictatorships in the world. They've never left in all this time, right? And under their rule, Equatorial Guinea should have prospered. They went through an oil boom from the early 90s into the 2000s. And the money from that oil boom should have been used to enrich the country, to develop public services, to improve the everyday lives of people. But instead, it was completely looted. And I think the most so well in the report is the story of Riggs Bank, which essentially found that the Obiang family used a US bank to launder funds, this process that Abby described, and the bank was used to clean the money, right, to make it seem legitimate, because funds from Equatorial Guinea went into the bank, Riggs Bank, and then went out to purchase luxury assets around the world. And Teodoro is a particular character, right? He's the son of Teodoro, the current president. At the time that he bought 2 properties in South Africa, located in Bishop's Court and Clifton, he was the Minister of Forestry and Agriculture. He was earning $4,000 a month. He didn't just buy assets in South Africa, he bought assets in France, in the UK, in the US, hundreds of millions of dollars. There was a Gulfstream jet that he bought with 40 million USD. Michael Jackson, he was a Michael Jackson fan, memorabilia worth almost 2 million US dollars. This is just flagrant waste. And those properties were mansions. I mean, some of them were over 100 million USD, that was the cost. And despite what we know, despite there being investigations in France where $160 million of assets were seized, investigations in the US where he reached a settlement but he was found guilty of crimes, investigations in the UK where he was sanctioned for misappropriating funds, all of them found that he stole money from his people. He still lives a life of excess, and I encourage everybody here who has an Instagram account. He's popularly known as Teddy Nguema, so everybody knows him as Teddy. He calls himself Teddy, and his Instagram account is kind of an archive of his life of lavish and luxury, but you can reframe that to say it's an archive potentially of his financial crimes. And it's just fascinating to see. It tells an incredible story, and I particularly encourage everybody to visit the comment section of his post.
Corin, let me introduce you now. Corin is a representative of Reclaim the City, also one of the leaders of the Sissy House here in Woodstock. Let's not limit this conversation and just say, oh, it is African leaders or African politically connected people who buys up property in Cape Town. There's, I think, sufficient evidence to say that we attract many a millionaire or a billionaire to this part of the world and to this country. But we also have the constitutional provision of property rights, Section 25 of the Constitution. We haven't made any determination around foreign land ownership, unlike Canada, who has sought to protect citizens and also then protect them from a ballooning property market. But when you hear of these vast amounts of money being deposited into the South African property market, how does it affect someone who is maybe a first-time prospective homeowner, someone who wants to get on their feet, someone who is a recipient of a state-funded subsidized home but wants to grow their family? How does this affect the most vulnerable of working people in South Africa?
Good afternoon, everyone. Lester, I want to start to say that South Africa has a housing crisis. In Cape Town alone, there are more than in the Western Cape, more than 600,000 people who are waiting on state-subsidized housing. And it really, it's sad, and it's actually a crime that there are people who have property, so much property, and others who don't have any. It shows that we're living in an unequal city, in an unequal society. And, you know, there's another thing about property. When we speak about property, for the most vulnerable, we don't speak about property, we speak about land. We speak about land and land for living. And it's really sad that that people in Cape Town, I can speak to the rest of South Africa, but I mean, in Cape Town alone, are actually being criminalized for occupying or living in informal settlements. The government is saying that there's no land. And then secondly, they're also saying that there's no money to build housing. And it really has an impact on the most vulnerable, particularly those who are waiting for the much needed housing. I mean, in this room alone, there are a few people sitting here that I know of that have been waiting for housing for more than 30 years. And people die waiting for housing. And here's someone who just comes into the country, buys property, prime property, when there's so many who are in need of housing. They are in need of access to well-located housing so that they can be close to places of work, schools, and hospitals. I mean, we have so many domestic workers who work in these affluent suburbs where properties purchased and where exclusionary developments are built. And these people are working there most of their lives, and they can't afford to live close to where they work. They need to spend more than half of their salaries or their wages to travel to get to work. So it really has an impact on people who are in need of housing, people who are in need of land for housing. Because at this stage, what the state is saying is that either there's no land or either there's no money to build housing. And we're saying that we're really living in an anti-poor society. An anti-poor society who prioritizes the needs of a few wealthy people and really do not even think about or consider and housing, by the way, is a necessity. It's a basic human right. In the Constitution, in Section 26, the Constitution says that everyone has the right to adequate housing. But it's very sad to see that people are either living in informal settlements and very recently in occupied buildings.
Zai, maybe I can also press you on that. It's not just South Africans who seek housing opportunities. Maybe you can explain what is the experience of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants in seeking and accessing housing in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you very much. Before to get on that, I'm just going to touch on the money laundering system, which I'll be try to make us to understand. Because this is a channel which drive us to tend to a land where we're being called kwiri, and because of the system of money laundering, which making us as people of Congo don't have even a value of human existence in terms of the right of a normal human can have, like a house, like a proper way of living. It affects us back home, and it drives us here in South Africa so that we can look for how can we survive and how can we put ourselves in the proper way of to have a value. But landing in South Africa, I think, realized that so many of us have a serious challenge of housing, a place to stay, and because of the limitation of documentation, because, you know, for you to access any house, you must have a document, and the Home Affairs system excludes a big number of refugees to access document, affect them to lose their house because that system put them out in their job, they don't have access of job, to their bank, which become frozen because of the lack of documentation. They freeze the bank account and they don't have access of a house. And also those who they try to approach the government as they have a legal documentation for their rights, because any refugee doesn't have a right to vote, have other rights as a South African has. But in that sector, we are really excluded, and there's so many of us under stress. We notice that there's so many refugees. We find them dead because they have too much stress and they don't know where to go, and then the number of the people dying because of stress is starting increasing in our society. So this is the channel which the money laundering causing from home to the land which you run to, and you starting paying the price. It's like the money laundering system casing us wherever we go, and all the system stopping us to exist and to carry on living with all the rights we need in this life. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Zai, before I get, and I want to focus next on the enabling environment, but this report is also in partnership for the Platform to Protect Whistleblowers in Africa. What does it mean currently in DRC to be a vocal opposition voice to corruption at the moment? Would we be able to have this platform at a similar venue?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I have to be honest because I'm standing for the people. I'm not standing for any power or anyone. So as I'm standing from the people, I'll talk for the people. Right now, currently, we're still challenging the system of a proper justice and the proper protection of our people. And Are we going to have the same venue in Congo right now, talking sensitive matter? Because we touch in Kabila, and the one is in position now, in power now, it's opposite Kabila. But we started noticing the similar thing happening. I think the investigation should carry on, not only in Kabila time, but there's already a lot of Congolese people who are in power. They have a lot of houses and flats they are building in Parkland, which is becoming very serious. Some in Thailand. So I think it's like a continuity. It doesn't matter what happened in time of Kabila, it's still going to happen, it's still continue to happen up to now. So these events, I'll say it cannot be allowed to happen in Congo right now. Mostly, it can happen only when we voice out for Kabila, because he's not in power. But when we're trying to touch those one in power right now, it's going to be a chaos. Why? Because there was an issue of corruption which happened in Congo. The judgment was open in TV where they supposed to build houses for people. That money of the houses disappear. And then the one in charge was in prison, and I don't want to name. And then after that, he come out and become the president of the Assembly of Congo. So that is the problem. So we're not going to have an easy conversation in the same topic because we still have a problem. That's why the Congolese civil society is trying to invite the one in charge of corruption system in Congo, financially, which they call IGF, to come here because the president, so that we can ask him a question to explain to us. You must know, Congolese people become a refugee because of the corruption happening there. How can you stop that? So we are wishing they're going to respond positively. It's going to be in Cape Town. We're going to invite you, and we're going to try to make it in 2 languages so that everybody can be in a good understanding. So my answer is going to be, I don't think we're going to have this conversation if we touch the one is in government now. But if we touch the previous one, they will support us 100%.
If you read the report, you'd also read that Theodorin of Equatorial Guinea admits that he has never lived in his Clifton mansion. It remains empty, and that is in contrast to many of the experiences of the people in Cape Town. But Abby, I'm a privileged middle-class South African. I have the privilege of, I don't call myself a homeowner, I'm a bond repayer, and I will be doing so for the next 17 years. But in order to buy a house, I needed to approach the bank, and then I then also approached a real estate agent, and then through a real estate agent, then a conveyancer. I had to jump through hoops. I had to sign documents. My statements were checked. They asked for proof of employment. It was a rigorous process in order for me, a very average middle-class South African. Talk to me about the enabling environment where 11 properties can be bought in a single day, where money can be transferred to shell companies. You call a lawyer, you call a real estate agent. Hello, I'm from Mozambique or Equatorial Guinea or from Congo, from anywhere else. I want to buy properties. What is this environment like where I expect, like what I had to jump through the hoops, were there hoops for any of these individuals to be checked whether or not their money that they say they had is in this country legally?
I guess, firstly, on your comment about Teddy Obiang, I guess on Karen's point about wanting land to live, and the idea that this individual is not even living in this home at all. There's no one in there, right? I think that's incredibly astonishing. on the estate agents and lawyers. You're right. I too, hopefully one day when I'm 80, hope to own a home. I don't know if that will happen. But that aside, you're right. There is an incredibly rigorous process that has to be done when you are trying or attempting to purchase a property, right? Many of us can speak to this. You need an ID, right? You basically need some kind of proof that you actually have residency in the country that you're trying to kind of purchase the property, or at the very least show that you have some kind of relationship within the country, right? Whether it's a business or something of the sort. You need to have a bank account. You need to have the actual money to kind of purchase the property itself. Where the estate agents and lawyers come into it, the first person that you're going to kind of be in touch with when you're trying to purchase a property is going to be the real estate agent. And it's actually quite interesting. We were speaking about this earlier in the office, the Open Secrets team, about, you know, who exactly is supposed to be held to account and responsible for the checks and balances, ensuring that the money that is being used to purchase these properties isn't actually corrupt funds, but actually legitimate. And throughout that entire process, the real estate agent is involved in it, right? They're the ones trying to sell the property. And then on top of that, they're the ones who's going to finish the deal. I want to take a moment to kind of just read a response from one of the lawyers. Sorry, it was just incredibly interesting. So one of the lawyers who was involved in the purchasing of the DRC, like basically the money that was used from the DRC by the Selamanis to purchase properties in South Africa, responded to us. We sent them a list of questions asking them, you know, was checks and balances done? You know, at what point did you actually consider that these individuals are not using legitimate funds to purchase these properties? But then on top of that, in the case of Selamani specifically, was selling the properties to themselves. Basically sell it, like they owned the properties and then they would sell it to companies that they owned. And it was quite astonishing. A major law firm, South African law firm called Cliff Decker Hofmeyer, was involved in the purchases within the DRC case study here in South Africa. And they wrote back to us. And let me just kind of find something that really astonished us. They wrote, "This was a typical property sale and transfer transaction, and it is common practice for foreigners to purchase property in South Africa using a shell company." Astonishing. One of the other lawyers within the report, as well in the DRC case study, they're called Van Sale Hertenberger Inc. They were also involved in the DRC property sales that happened in South Africa. And we basically asked them, you know, did you at any point actually do due diligence and follow what the FICA Act basically requires you to do as a party that is a part of the transaction itself? They wrote back to us and said, let me just find this. In fact, it ought to be recorded and you ought to be aware that the relevant legislation was only implemented recently and did not in fact apply at any time that the transactions you are referring to were implemented by our firm. Open Secret sent a further reply to Fund Sale that the FICA had been established in 2001 and that relevant laws had applied. Now you tell me, Lester, when you were trying to kind of secure your property and, you know, going through everything with your bond at the moment, Did you ever think that you would create a shell company to assist you? Maybe that's something I'll do when I'm 80 and I'm trying to do this. But it's just kind of astonishing to me that this, particularly the lawyers that were involved in the DRC case study and in the other case studies that we speak about in the report, are practicing their businesses with this type of attitude.
But now, Raisa, if maybe you can just explain to us, because many people, particularly many young people, say, I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm going to walk into a Volkswagen or a BMW with a bag of money, and I'm going to say, give me that M3. It doesn't work like that. FICA says if there is a transaction above a certain amount, and there's reason to suspect that we need to look a little bit deeper, that's what needs to be done. It is an obligation of entities, banks, to say, okay, you can't just walk in here with a suitcase of money. If you do, we need to tell the state that this gentleman, Lester, walked in with a bag of money and he wants a M3. That is simply just dodgy. What does FICA say in terms of how you go about transacting to buy property?
I mean, I wonder what people think the cash threshold is to report. I mean, Lester, what would you say? If you didn't know what the cash threshold is, what would you think the cash threshold is?
My car is 15 years old, so I haven't bought a car.
So actually, like, back when the FICA was implemented, which was 2003, the cash threshold to report, so if you were to buy a property in cash, right? If you use 25,000 Rand cash, it would trigger an obligation on the lawyers, the estate agents, or any business party involved in that transaction to make a report to the Financial Intelligence Center. And let me just kind of talk for a second about the Financial Intelligence Center, right? So we often just call it the FIC for short. And their duty is to kind of get intelligence from the private sector institutions, and they then use this intelligence and give it to law enforcement agencies like the Hawks to investigate further, and so that the NPA can one day prosecute if there's a case to answer for the people who are involved in these transactions, right? When you look at the amounts of money used to purchase houses in this report, it is staggering. I'll give you an example, right? There was a guy called Bruno Langa. Bruno was a friend of Ndabi Guebuza. Ndambe Guebuza was the son of the president Armando Guebuza in Mozambique at the time that the hidden debt scandal took place. Now, Bruno helped a private company fix the hidden debt scandal so that Mozambique would accept the $2 billion in loans, and then none of this would be used for public services, but instead it would be used to pay kickbacks and bribes to this private company, Privinvest, and to people like Bruno, who essentially fixed the deal and made all the introductions between the private sector, the private company, and the government officials. Bruno got a cut from the deal. He made millions, right, in bribes. The private company called Privinvest was based in Abu Dhabi. They paid the money, the millions, I think it was in excess of $15 million, into Bruno Langa's account in Abu Dhabi. The account was in his name. Bruno Langa then transferred 9 million Rand from that Abu Dhabi bank account that he had in his name to the trust account of Pam Golding Estate Agency in South Africa. He bought a house in a luxury golf estate in Dainfern, and he paid cash. 9 million Rand cash, right? Pam Golding should have made a report to the FIC. The FIC should have done intelligence. That intelligence should have gone to the police. What was so interesting about this investigation is that actually a few years ago, a journalism project, investigative journalism project called the OCCRP, also reported, they exposed that Pam Golding had also been the estate agency that enabled Ndambi to purchase homes in South Africa too. That triggered an investigation, right? The public exposure of Pam Golding's role in that triggered an investigation by the estate regulator at the time. And the regulator told us that they found that Pam Golding had done nothing wrong. We have questions about that. We also have questions about if Pam Golding, and there was another famous estate agency that was also involved in some of these estate purchases called Remax. You may know their blue, red, and white logo. And they refused to tell us if they made suspicious transactions reports because they said that the FIC didn't allow them to do it. We also don't know if they made the reports to report the cash threshold because surely 9 million rand is more than
9
enough.
million rand cash is very heavy also.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I haven't felt myself, but I'm quite certain it's quite
Yeah.
heavy to carry.
Yeah, and I mean, there was another law firm called Harold Gee. It's not quite as big as Cliff Deck or Hofmeyer, but they were involved in Jacinto Nyusi, who is the son of former President Felipe Nyusi. I don't know if anybody's been paying attention to the news in Mozambique. Frelimo is still in power. People are very upset. They think that there may have been election fraud, and there's been a severe crackdown. And Nyusi was the outgoing president, and Chapo came in now. The situation there is devastating. And I think what was so interesting about this investigation was that we found that Jacinto, he actually had 2 homes in South Africa. The one home was in Constantia. It had been reported on in news media. But the debt scandal was exposed in 2016, and we found this year that he had another home in Sandhurst in Joburg that nobody had known about until now. He paid 17 million rand for that home. And this was in 2015. You can only imagine what that would be in today's terms with inflation. He sold that home, and so we can never ever seize the assets and the funds from that house because he sold both the Constantia and that home. The interesting thing was that in terms of the Constantia home, there was a law firm called Harold Gee. And Harold Gee told us that they really did do their jobs. They saw that Jacinto purchased this house in Constantia, and they were like, nah, there's something wrong with this. This looks weird. And so they made a suspicious transaction report to the FIC. What was interesting about their response was that they also said that the FIC did nothing according to what they could see because they didn't hear back from the FIC after they made that report. But if the FIC had acted, perhaps Jacinto wouldn't have been able to sell that home. I think he made a 1 million rand profit because he bought it for like 3 million rand and he sold it for 4. But that money is gone, and the people from Mozambique would never essentially see what they are owed because that money can never now be repatriated back to Mozambique. We don't know what he did with it.
I'm hearing lots of moans and of affirmation, but also concern from our audience. I'd like to open it up for questions. But before I do that, and our people who are doing that, getting the mics ready, Raisa, Open Secrets has already reported on the enablers of corruption. I spoke about corrupto corrupti and the often professional institutions that enable these. You need a lawyer to do and to sign off on the very intricate legal contracts. You need the property practitioners. You need the auditors to sign off on that. In your experience in reporting and investigating the enabling network of professional institutions, why don't we talk about that enough?
I think that I think on the one hand, people are very quick to talk about the state and what the state does wrong. And there's a lot of anger towards the state, and it is directed in the right way because we vote for these government officials who then represent us in parliament, and we expect that they will look after our best interests, right? The work that Karen at Reclaim the City does, the work that Azaya does with the Congolese Civil Society of South Africa, these are crucial works, and we expect that government should take this activism seriously because people deserve housing. Refugees and migrants deserve rights in South Africa. They are part of the community. All of these people who make your Constantias and your Clistons pristine and desirable, but then they are treated with disrespect, with dismissiveness. And our society is getting more unequal. We didn't vote for this, so that anger is directed in the right way. But often I don't think there is enough scrutiny of the private sector because it seems so far away from what's happening. We don't always understand that these key players play a direct role in facilitating and enabling corruption, that without them, as you say, these transactions could not take place. I mean, Abby spoke about the shell companies. To set up shell companies, you need lawyers. And some lawyers do this for a living. All they do is set up shell companies for corrupt actors, and nobody holds them to account. And that is why, I think that reports that the ones that we do, like this report and the others that you may have seen around this room, are so important. And we work together with our colleagues in civil society, like Reclaim the City, Indifuna Kwazi, the Congolese Civil Society Organization of South Africa, to develop a full picture of how corruption is enabled in the country and how it fits into the international network of patronage and illicit financial flows to harm people both around the world and here in South Africa. Lester, one thing, it would be remiss of me not to say that when you read this report, there's a lot of legal analysis of the FICA and of the estate agencies and the lawyers and what they did wrong. And my colleague, Nkomo, who's not on stage, but she is in the audience, she was responsible for a lot of that work. And it's really interesting to see that we have these laws, but they're just not being implemented the way that they should be.
And I open it to our audience. If you could put up your hand, introduce yourself. A round of applause as well for this. But if you have a question, please do put up your hand and identify yourself. Karen, Reclaim the City is not unfamiliar in dealing with property developers. You have often done sit-ins, you've occupied pieces of land, you've actively agitated property developers. So, what has been your experience in the role of property developing and the connection between the people who make the decisions in city council, in province, at the national government level?
I mean, I just want, with that said, Lester, I want to make an example of a site of public land that was sold in 2018 to a private developer's Growth Point Properties. And we campaigned, we protested the sale, or this piece of land was auctioned. And it was auctioned at a discounted rate to Growth Point Properties. And at the time, we went and we protested the sale of the site, but we also protested, in fact, we challenged private property development because people are living in squalor in the townships and on the peripheries. Others who are in need of housing, well-located housing, the money, we challenge the fact that the money could have been used for basic services and to build housing. And this happened in 2018 when we went to do the protests. Growth Point Properties then took us to court, but it was so surprising to see how politicians were equally involved with the sale of this private property to the developers. And we went to court with them, and well, we actually we symbolically occupied the site for one day to protest private property or white monopoly property. And they took us to court. We were removed there from the premises. And it really showed, because we may have had a small victory in not paying the legal fees, because they took us to court, but for calling them out. But the thing here is that nothing has happened since, because the Municipal Planning Tribunal case stated that the developers, they state that a portion of that development would be used for affordable or social housing. And then COVID-19 happened, and all of these public participation processes and all of the development then went ahead without consulting the public. And so, and there too, of course, there was city officials who were involved in the sale of Site B, as it is and was known. And so that was just one example how we see that how property is, or land, how land is prioritized for the wealthy and not for the poor. And then there's many other examples where we went to go and disrupt private property development, especially around the Woodstock area, because people were evicted from rental housing in Woodstock and Salt River. Many of our members, as I'm sitting here, are one of the people who have been evicted from a rental home that my family had been living in for decades. And there's so many others in Woodstock and Salt River who were evicted due to the high rise in rental housing.
Karen, if I may just interject there and just draw your mind to that symbolic occupation of the Growth Point property in the CBD. We do know that when it is state property or public property, law enforcement is called in, but if it's private property, private security is called in. I remember that occupation. There was quite literally a tank owned by a private security company. You had private security armed to the teeth. I would hope to think that the state, because there's a lot more scrutiny on the state, there are public institutions that make sure that the police, law enforcement act in a just manner. But do you feel that there is a different level of response, intensity of response, if it is private property and private security is then called in to action, some form of intimidation or eviction?
I mean, I think even when you call on the law enforcement agencies versus the private security companies or military, because I would actually call them military, because when they came to remove us with the sheriff of the court, of course, they came there armed. It was as if they were going to fight a war. And ours was a peaceful protest. And it showed me that there's quite a lot of violence involved in that kind of issue. So there was that, and it's quite intimidating.
Yeah.
It's more intimidating than having the South African police force coming to sort, like they say, they're coming there to sort things out. They're coming there to see to it that things are done peacefully and lawfully.
South African law enforcement and police don't themselves have a glowing record when it comes to public order policing. But Abby, there is some news in terms of what you are recommending, what you want the interventions to be. That in fact there's a recommendation, or in fact an insistence from Open Secrets in laying a complaint with the National Prosecuting Authority when it comes to, for example, the DRC case. What is the latest? Has there been a response from the National Prosecuting Authority? Has there been a response from state entities that are supposed to address money laundering and, in this case, property laundering of politically connected people?
So earlier today, in collaboration with PLOF and a DRC coalition called Congo is Not for Sale, Open Secrets published the fact that we laid a criminal complaint to the MPA in April last year. And essentially, what the criminal complaint spoke to was the fact that Francis Selemani had purchased these properties using illegal funds, and that the MPA needs to investigate, prosecute, seize those assets, and return the funds to the Congolese people. We released that statement today, so hopefully a lot of media is going to report on that as well. But to give everyone context, we submitted that complaint roughly 19 months ago, and we have not received much of an update at all about what the status of the investigation is. And so us informing the public that we have laid this criminal complaint is essentially a call for action to occur, to kind of give a sense of the urgency of the matter. They're selling the properties off. So the Selemanis and the companies that they own in South Africa are essentially kind of selling these properties off. And as Ray has described earlier, that money is almost irretrievable.
Zaya, I'd just like your response, and then I'll round up this conversation. If properties are seized, if they are liquidated, and assets and money is sent back to, for example, the DRC, but already with a government with not the cleanest track record of clean fiscal governance and prudence, how do we not know it's going to happen all over again? How do you know that money goes to servicing the people of DRC?
Thank you very much. This is a tricky question. Thank you very much for asking it. I think we are fighting the system of Congo to change because we believe that the progress of financial system of Congo to be established properly, it's gonna give Africa to grow, Africa to develop, because the wealth of Congo, it's going to influence the financial system of all of us in Africa. So we are fighting that. The system of Congo in government right now, pretending to fight that, I have to be honest on that, but we are not seeing something being put in place properly. So if everything's been sold, like, okay, there's the money, it must be returned in Congo. For me, in my personal opinion, I believe that the money should be given to the government who we can trust, or if it's not given to the government can trust, it can be given to the civil society we can trust. Because we still have a challenge of the money which need to be paid in Congo government from the disaster which happened the time they built the first atomic bomb, which they used the uranium coming from Congo, where the United States still have to fix that, so that the disaster of a nuclear which happened in Congo, the time they were fixing the first atomic bomb by Oppenheimer, never be resolved. So they're still waiting for which government. So we're still pushing that the Congolese civil society to South Africa. In this case, again, I think all the money should be given to the civil society organization, which we trust, if the government are still the same government which we can trust. Because according to me, we have a challenge of Congolese children who are not accessing university here. They are very clever, they are very intelligent. Why can't we support and develop a system to push the children of Congolese for educational program, for so many program? One day they can go back with a proper system, a clear mind of governing Congo properly.
Bryce, I'll have you have the last word. As you said in describing the environment in which South Africa was grey listed, not the only African country, Mauritius, they managed to do a turnaround in 18 months. It was a few weeks ago when the finance minister says, well, we're actually on our route there. Our banking regulations, our systems, even our legislation appears to be on paper quite sound. It's all about implementation, and also the political will to do so. What do you want the outcomes of this report to be?
Thanks, Lester. I just want to go back to the question that Isaiah answered and also say that there has been an example set in the international community. So in Equatorial Guinea, the US Department of Justice reached a settlement with Teodoron Obiang for 30 million USD, and 10 million of that was paid to the UN for COVID-19 vaccines. It was not given directly to the government of Equatorial Guinea. They said, no, doesn't seem like we can trust you guys. So instead they send it to the UN. So there are examples where even if you can't trust the government, you can give it to agencies that can perhaps help make a difference potentially. To answer your question, we make a number of recommendations at the end of this report that really speak to what we're trying to hope to achieve. But I think the most important is that law enforcement agencies need to act to seize the assets while they are still in the hands of these PEPs so that the money can be brought back, recovered, and put back to where it belongs. We need to start setting examples that this can happen. I think at the moment, the SIU, the Special Investigating Unit, is perhaps doing the best job of this.
Exceptionally busy. Not 2 days go by till you have an SIU press release saying that assets have been attached by the special tribunal and forfeited to the state. So it is an institution that is working quite.
Yeah, it's fantastic. The problem is that the SIU only works according to the presidential proclamation. So basically, Ramaphosa has to sign a little document at his desk to say, yes, you can investigate this, and then the SIU can do its fantastic work. We need this effectiveness in our police forces and in the NPA so that when we also want to see them releasing press statements every 2 days saying, we've seized this asset that belonged to this person. We're waiting for it to happen. And I think that would make a big difference. And then secondly, we do want the FIC to start acting against these private institutions. We want the lawyers and the estate agents to start doing their reporting. As Abby said, the FIC has been begging them to send in the reports that are required for South Africa to get off the grey list. And it's astonishing that like a third of lawyers and estate agents haven't submitted these reports. So we need them to start doing their jobs because this is what they're supposed to do. And just because you wear a suit and look fancy doesn't mean you're doing a good job.
Well, we hope that there is a response from the Property Practitioners Regulatory Council, that there is a movement on that, and as you said, that there is action from law enforcement. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Do engage with this report. As Raisa said, times it is very dense, but it means something. There's no point, and I think what this latest US presidential election told us, was retold, it was all about economics. It's no use simply just saying it's about the cost of a liter of milk without knowing what influences that liter of milk. You have to empower, have to educate yourselves as well. Well, ladies and gentlemen, do get home safely and enjoy the rest of your day.